This is very crucial, Anil. I assumed that God equates to sheer power. This thing I read flipped the thing on its head and said, no, God's primary attribute, if you will, is love. And love holds power in reserve in favor of freedom, and freedom is risky. And so, as an 18-year-old person, a basic equation was developed in my understanding. Love requires freedom in order to exist. And freedom has the upside potential for good and the downside potential for evil. It's risky, in other words. Love, freedom, risk. And that became for me the master equation of reality. I thought, okay, now I can accept the existence of a God if the primary means by which that God operates is love rather than power. Because then I could say, okay, God is not implicated. His character is not implicated in violence and war and starvation. You could have a supreme being who chooses love over control. As you know, for want of better terminology, God's value system, at the pinnacle of God's value system is, I prefer love over control. If I were to control you, you would become machines or robots or you know, AI. You would just become some kind of...
Not a who, but a what.
You'd become a what. So God opts for love over power as his primary mode of being. And that was my conversion. When I saw that idea, I said, okay, I'm in.
It began to reshape everything in your life, recalibrate everything in your life.
And his kingdom ethic was that love trumps power. Love trumps coercion. Love is, in the final analysis, more powerful than violence. There's a New Testament scholar who's deceased now named Walter Wink, who came up with a term. He coined a term, and that term is the myth of redemptive violence. The myth of redemptive violence. And this is the idea that the only way to conquer evil is with violence, with coercion, with power, with a military. You've got an evil empire, you've got an evil person.
A villain.
A villain. The villain can only be conquered by more of what the villain has going on in the villain's psyche. So in the general mythological understanding of human beings, for example, every story of the world, Anil, in every culture, no matter where you drop your finger in history or culture, there's one story on repeat. And that story on repeat is the myth of redemptive violence. The myth of redemptive violence says that, and our current manifestation of that is in the superhero comics and the movies that are made from those comics. Superman's the good guy. Batman's the good guy. Spider-Man's the good guy. What makes Thor the good guy in these superhero narratives? Well, they're just more powerful than the bad guy, but they operate by the same principles. So the bad guy uses power, violence, deception. Well, the good guys in these myths, right, use what? Power, violence, deception to conquer evil. Jesus comes along and he overturns all of that. Well, and he says, I'm going to conquer at the heart level. I'm going to win you by love and truth and empathy. This is a completely different kind of kingdom. So the myth of redemptive violence, for example, is on repeat continually in human imagination, you know, with the Greek myths and the superhero comics of our time. It's always more of the same. The good guy operating by the same basic character and principles as the bad guys, just more of it, you know. So the good guy is just more violent, more powerful, more muscles, more might. And then Jesus comes along and he completely upends our view of power. He turns power on its head, and that's because in Jesus, what we encounter is a complete redefining of power. In God's value system, love is more powerful than anything else. Violence is actually weakness. Coercion is weakness. I could physically, with an implement of force in my hand, right?
Right.
A gun, for example, which is an implement of power, implement of force. I could say to you, stand up, and you'd stand up. I'd say sit down, you'd sit down. But if I pointed the same gun at you by which I could manipulate your bodily movements and said, love me, trust me, feel right now, and you'll feel loyalty toward me in the depths of your soul, feel loyalty. You could lie to me. You could say, I love you, I trust you, I'm loyal, don't shoot. But you'd be lying, because love and force cannot occupy the same emotional space simultaneously.
Wow.
Everybody who's married knows this, right? To the degree that in a marriage relationship you lean in with control and force and manipulation, the person you are married to leans out of your control. To the degree that you lean out, they lean in. So there's this free space between two morally free beings that has to be crossed voluntarily. And the voluntary bridge is love. God comes into the world and he says, I'm going to save you by loving you into salvation. I'm not going to manipulate you. I'm not going to force you. I'm going to show you the highest manifestation of the glory of God in a weak, vulnerable babe born in Bethlehem who's going to grow up and voluntarily subject himself to the powers that be, and he's going to be crucified voluntarily. John's Gospel in John chapter 13, verse 1 says, he loved them to the end, ... To what end? To the end of himself, to the utter and complete end of himself. He just kept on loving you and loving me above and before himself. His crucifixion was the logical outgrowth of, the logical conclusion of loving others more than self. At any point in the process, according to the Gospels, Jesus told Peter, put your sword away, when Peter was using an implement of violence to defend Jesus, right?
Right.
Same theme. Violence to defend him. Jesus said, put your sword away, Peter. Don't you know that I could call to my Father and he would immediately send 12 legions of angels to deliver me? The point is this. Jesus was never in a corner that he couldn't escape. His back was never against a wall. He could have abandoned the human race at any point in the process and left us to perish. He wasn't backed into a corner. He voluntarily gave his life for us, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. And it's that want factor that is where love resides. I want you. I want to save you. I want to die for you. I don't have to. I choose you over me. That's mind-blowing. That is, so you can say that Jesus really is, Anil, final point on this. Jesus is truly the only genuine, authentic revolutionary in history. Because every other revolution is the same in principle and character as the power it's trying to topple. Let's bear arms against the oppressor. Jesus comes along and voluntarily dies for the violent, the oppressor. He dies for the human race. This is a completely counterintuitive, completely upside down kind of kingdom that is nothing like. Jesus is the anti-king of a non-kingdom.
You know, it's interesting because you think about a lot of these Jews at the time that Jesus showed up. They were expecting a Messiah who would come with force of arms.
That's right.
Someone similar to the Caesars. Someone that would bring glory to their kingdom, glory to their nation, a glory to themselves. And Jesus frustrated them, even frustrated his own disciples over and over again, because his own disciples wanted the same.
They wanted a military Messiah. They were looking for political triumph over Rome, and they wanted a Messiah who would come that would exalt Israel to the pinnacle of political and military power, to use the principles of coercion against Rome. Jesus came along and he said crazy things like, love not only your neighbor, he went a step further, love your enemy. Jesus came along and he said, forgive those who use and abuse you. What? And that's in the immediate context of an occupied Judea. Rome is an occupying force, and Jesus is looking at the Roman soldiers who represent Caesar, and he's saying, love them. Love them? In what way? How do we love them? And Jesus went to the cross as the King of the Jews to show us what power really looks like. When he died on the cross, the disciples thought he wasn't really the king, because a king wouldn't have let that happen to him.
Wouldn't have allowed it.
Right? But the irony is that he was, in fact, the king. He was introducing a whole new power into the human race. We are today, Anil, the beneficiaries in all Western democracy. We are the beneficiaries of the the released principles from Jesus working their way into political systems down through the ages, until finally, with the American Revolution and the Constitution of the United States of America and the Bill of Rights, the Constitution of the United States of America that we take for granted, right, is the gospel of Christ in the form of a governing document. All men are created equal, endowed with a creator, with, right? This language, this new way of governing with no pope, no king, anti-monarchy, this new way of governing where the people govern from the bottom up voluntarily. This is a completely different way of processing reality, and Jesus and the Apostle Paul, as the practitioner of the gospel of Christ, Jesus and Paul are the author of all the positive developments in history for the last 2,000 years.
Their writings, their teachings, have provided a train of thought that have led to greater liberties,
that's right,
equality.
That's right.
And obviously we're still on a journey with this, but
we're still on a major journey.
Right.
Yeah.
The United States being the last great experiment for humanity.
And that experiment is teetering on the edge. We're now witnessing some totalitarian impulses in Western democracy that, if not checked, will lead to an overturning of the principles that came from the gospel into governing systems.
It seems that the whole tension of Scripture is this idea of the love of power versus the power of love.